Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State chat by Joel Haas of the Daily Collegian and the Post-Gazette. We're going to get into a conversation about Penn State finishing drives, how it dovetails with the kicking problem, and how that's maybe affecting perception of the Nittany Lions, both locally within the fan base and nationally. Going to talk about the running game that was great on Saturday against Illinois and the sneaky whiteout game, Kaytron Allen, Nick Singleton, talk a little bit about the passing game, Abdul Carter, and then look at some things around the country that I think are interesting trends for Penn State to keep an eye on, especially some teams off to hot starts in the Big Ten. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Voodoo Brewing Company, State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue at 322 Route 322 and 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is our game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, and this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. Okay, Joel, let's get into this. Penn State, by my count, has 6 drives this season where it was in what I would refer to as scoring range, which is kind of the opponent's 35-yard line. And they don't come away with points on those drives. 3 of them were missed field goals, 1 at West Virginia and 2 this past week against Illinois. 2 were the interceptions. Drew Allar's in the red zone. And then I believe Bo Pribula's interception was down deep a little bit. And then and that was in the the Kent State game. And then you had the turnover on downs Saturday against Illinois, where you probably could have kicked it if you didn't have a kicking issue, but you go for it and come away with nothing. There's a lot of different ways we can talk about this situation. I think number one, how do you think it's impacting perception of this offense that you have basically 6 scoring drives that should have been scoring drives that. And I think they were at kind of critical moments, too. You think about that Kent State game. It was early. It was the second drive of the game, I believe, when Bo Pribula throws the interception, and people start getting restless. Of course, Penn State goes on to beat them, but there was, kind of a restless first half, really just because of that one drive that you don't get points on. Illinois, you have the 3 kind of packed together, even though you're moving the ball pretty well and consistently against, pretty good defense in Illinois. Penn State was in what it felt like a ball game for a lot longer than maybe the way they were moving the ball suggested. So how do you think, the fact that they're not finishing these drives is impacting this kind of anxiety that seems to be rearing itself within the fan base?
Yeah, well, I think what it does to the perception is it makes the offense seem a lot worse than it actually does, or than it actually is, especially with those missed field goals in particular. Obviously, Penn State has kind of an issue at the kicker position with Sander Sahaydak falling to 2 for 5 this season. We saw Ryan Barker go in for that 3rd touchdown for the extra point there, so it looks like Penn State is potentially moving on. He's had kind of an up and down season. We thought he maybe had some things figured out, and then it looks like all the issues kind of came back with a couple missed 40-yarders. And, it's not like those are long field goals that, are kind of 50-50, chances. Those should be, easy field goals that you should be making probably 90-95% of the time as a D1 kicker. So obviously I have to believe that that's mental, especially because we've heard that, Sahadak's max range is 60 yards. So for him to be, going 0 for 2, both from 40 yards, you have to think that it's more of a mental thing than it is, some issue with his leg or anything like that. So I think I would mainly point to the kicking issues, but yeah, that definitely shifts kind of the perception of the offense, because that's a lot of points that Penn State's leaving on the board. And I think, a 27-7 win sounds a lot better than 21-7, or if they, maybe kick on that 1 4th down that they went for, maybe 30-7, which obviously 30-7, that sounds more like a blowout compared to what it ended up being. So I think that kind of is changing the perception. I was interested to see, so Parker Fleming, on Twitter will tweet every week. He'll post the how bad did we really get beat rankings, which is basically the success rate between the winning and losing team. And out of every FBS game, Penn State actually had the widest margin of success rate over Illinois. So the difference between Penn State's success rate and Illinois' success rate was the widest margin in any game, and yet they only win by 2 scores, right? So I think the score was a little bit misleading compared to how well Penn State played in that game. And I think it goes back to those kicking issues, which maybe Penn State will have figured out, because I go back to what Franklin was saying over the summer, where you obviously had a three-way competition between Sahaydak, Ryan Barker, and Chase Meyer, who transferred in from Tulsa, and it was a very tight competition. And Franklin said that between the three of them, throughout camp, they were within 1 or 2 percentage points of each other. Well, I'm wondering what that percentage point was. Was it between 0, 1, and 2%? Because Sahaydak has been awful, and for some reason they've been really hesitant to kind of bring in anyone else. But again, Ryan Barker got in at the very end of that Illinois game for that last extra point, so maybe he's the guy they move with going forward. Franklin was asked about it this week and kind of deferred. He said, it's kind of an open competition right now and they're still evaluating, so we really have no idea who they're going to trot out against UCLA. But I would pinpoint kind of those kicking issues as the main reason. But I do think it kind of hurts Penn State's reputation and kind of hurts the way people view the offense.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel that way. But here's the second question that I then have is perception reality if you don't, have a kicker? I think you mentioned what is the difference in percentage. Well, yeah, it could be 1 and 2%, and that could not be a huge deal. But if it's 65%, total success rate, and we're talking about the difference between 65 and 63 from 40 yards. I mean, that's an issue. So if you're Penn State, is this who they are if they don't have a consistent kicker? And is it really like a cause for alarm that you've left points on the board because you didn't finish drives with the offense while it's on the field? I think of that 4th down, that should have been a conversion if you're going to go for it, right? I mean, it was not like a long, incredibly crazy 4th down to go for it. It was a rational thing to try to do if you don't feel confident in your kicker, and you still don't get it. And the other nugget I found interesting from James Franklin's press conference this week is that he mentioned that they more or less know whether they're going to go for it on 4th down, on 1st down, so that Andy Kotelnicki can sequence the plays and set up that series of downs with using 4th down in mind. So, did they know they were going for it on that drive? Had they said on 1st down, yeah, we're going to go for it, and in those 4 downs, they can't get those 10 yards, considering how well they'd been moving the ball? I mean, is it a concern of yours, Joel, that they've left so many points on the board? And yes, it's partly a kicking issue, but also it's partly a moving the ball issue to have to kick in the first place, especially against some of these teams that you're just flat better than early in the schedule.
Yeah. No, it is a big concern at this point. And the one thing that kind of confuses me is that Chase Meyer at Tulsa last year was 17 for 20 on field goals. So he has proven that, at a D1 level, he can make field goals at a consistent clip. That's why the staff brought him in. So I wonder why, they've kind of refused to bring him in instead of Sahaydak. And even Ryan Barker came in against Illinois instead of Chase Meyer, which is just interesting to me because we know that Meyer can do it at a pretty high level based on what he was able to do at Tulsa. So it's kind of puzzling to me. They must have seen something that gives them that confidence in Sahaydak, and I'm not sure why they've been so hesitant to kind of switch to a different guy. But to go back to what you were saying about those 4th downs, I thought it was really interesting, kind of the decisions they made. We saw the 4th and 1 earlier in the game that they decided to punt on. I know the fans obviously were disappointed by that decision, as they always are when there's a 4th and 1 that the team doesn't go for. But James Franklin after the game he was very careful with his words. He tried to kind of sneak around it, but he was basically saying that they weren't afraid of Illinois' offense and was, they were more afraid of their defense. So they wanted to play kind of a field position game. They weren't worried about Illinois being able to put together a long drive. So they were going to just, kind of play it safe, play the field position game because they felt more confident in, I guess, their defense than in Illinois' offense to score. But again, it's a 4th and 1 situation, and it's a team that you view yourself as, a tier above them. You should be able to convert on those kind of 4th and 1 situations. And I think it was early enough in the game that even if you don't get it, you have plenty of time to kind of recover from that. But that was kind of the rationale that Franklin gave us afterward. And then you had the 4th and 3 where they did go for it and almost got it. I think it was Harrison Wallace catch and he kind of stretched out and was short, or maybe it was Julian Fleming who stretched out and just was, a few inches short of the line to gain there. So they were a little bit more aggressive later in the game. I kind of question why you don't go for it on 4th and 1, but you do go for it on 4th and 3. I don't know why they're kind of changing their mentality there. It just seems like a little bit more, questionable game calling from Franklin, which is kind of one of the things that fans have complained about for a long time with him.
It's 4th and 3 at USC. Well, let's say they're in a close game this week against UCLA somehow. It's 4th and 3. A field goal gives you the lead late. It's a kick you've absolutely got to have in most rational circumstances. Are you going for it? Or are you trying some of these other guys and putting your trust that whatever's going on with Sander Sahaydak is not an issue through that whole room? When the lights are on and the games matter.
I think again, there are some other factors that kind of play into it with, specifically how much time is left and where they are in the field. But I think I would kick in that situation. I just wouldn't let Sander Sahaydak be the one to do it. Whether it's Barker or Meyer, I think both of them have proven, or not proven, I guess, especially in Barker's case, because he hasn't really had any collegiate experience. But if they feel confident putting him in over Chase Meyer, I think that says something to me, given what we know Chase Meyer can do, who's a little bit more of a proven commodity at this point. I think I would at least give both of those guys a shot. I think they've at least earned the chance to kick at this point.
Well, and if you don't like some of these other guys' range and you think Sander Sahaydak has better range, I mean, I remember Ohio State for a long time had a long field goal kicker and a short field goal kicker. That came up in the 2016 game where they blocked the kick. Was the iconic Chris Fowler call, super reliable from inside 40 right before the kick is blocked. So, I mean, maybe that's something that they can tool with if, they want to try a 53-yard field goal and they don't feel the other guys can do it, then trot out Sander Sahaydak and, what do you have to lose? If you're kicking from that distance, maybe that's something that they have to keep in mind. Joel, Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen are rolling. I think this game kind of put an exclamation point on it, but their averages for the season, Nick Singleton I have written down at 7.7 per carry. Kaytron Allen's at 5.5. They're well ahead of where they were last season. Is it a matter of the offense and the difference between Mike Yurcich and Andy Kotelnicki and how much better Andy Kotelnicki is at putting those guys in a place to succeed? Or is it, these guys have improved markedly from, year 2 to year 3, and they were kind of putting that on display themselves? Because I remember there, particularly with Singleton last year, there was some conversation of whether he had put on a little bit of weight and had lost a little bit of the quickness that had made him so good as a freshman. What's your read on why they have turned it around so far? Albeit it's against, probably not the best teams on your schedule, but they weren't necessarily doing this to the bad teams last season either.
Yeah, it's honestly a very confusing situation to me, just because, you could say that it's, struggling under Mike Yurcich and then all of a sudden looking better under Kotelnicki, but you look at what they were able to do their freshman year, that was Yurcich as offensive coordinator, and they were still, very good players, one of the best, 1-2 running back combos in the country their freshman year, under Yurcich. And so it's kind of confusing why they had that step backward last year. But then, looking to this year, obviously what they've done to kind of bounce back and bring back that explosiveness, obviously the yards per carry way up, even though not necessarily explosive against Illinois. I think the longest run against Illinois was like 15 yards or something like that. And they both averaged in that like 5.5, 6 yard range, but it also felt like they were never getting behind the chains. All of their runs were kind of, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it was, not necessarily explosive, but also still kind of moving the ball forward, a little bit methodically. And it was obviously we saw success early. I was a little confused why they kind of went away from the run there, and felt like the second, maybe third quarter, they kind of went away from the run a little bit. Then they went back to it at the end, and it was successful again. But that's a whole different story. But yeah, I am confused by it just because, again, we saw them have success with Yurcich. So I don't know if we can say that, their success is solely because of Kotelnicki, because they're obviously both very talented running backs, and we've seen that before. I do think a lot of the credit should go to the offensive line. And that's something that, maybe that's a unit that might get overlooked at times, but Franklin went out of his way after the game to compliment the offensive line for the way they played. And then Drew Allar kind of said the same thing after the game, that the offensive line did a great job. Both Nick and Kaytron were at the post-game media. They both kind of went out of their way to credit the offensive line. Anytime, a reporter brought up the run game, everyone wanted to direct the attention to the offensive line, which is tough when you lose. Not only did they lose 3 starters to the NFL this offseason and, have all those moving pieces. And it's actually funny because they lost 2 tackles and a center to the NFL. Then against Illinois, they lost 2 guards who went down to injury. So you basically have an entire line gone from where you were a year ago. And so with a bunch of new guys in there and some shuffling around, Cooper Cousins got some run. JB Nelson came in relief and then went down with an injury. So, it was a rough situation there for Penn State, especially with those injuries. But I think the offensive line should get some credit for what it's been able to do so far this season in helping those guys.
Yeah, you can never downplay the blocking. There was never a time last season where I said, "Oh my God, the blocking is horrific." And this is a conversation Christopher Carter and I have with Najee Harris of, I expect a little more individual brilliance from good running backs, and if you're in a bad position, you still find a way to make better things out of that. And I didn't necessarily see that from Singleton and Allen last season. That was kind of my rub, but here they are making the play. So regardless of what the reason is, you hope for Penn State's sake that they can keep it going. Joel, I also wanted to talk about the passing game a little bit. Relatively quiet night for Drew Allar. I think he only threw 21 passes, completes 15 of them. Do you think this is the way Penn State wants to win identity-wise? Do we know what Penn State's identity is yet? And is it, if they can run the wheels off of Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton and have big nights, like they had against the Fighting Illini, do you think that's what they would prefer to do on most nights and not have Drew Allar putting up, huge numbers like he did, against Kent State?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if they have a preference necessarily, but I know that was Illinois' preference. It was funny because talking to Franklin before the game, he said that he knew kind of, having coached against Illinois before, having coached against Brett Bielema before, he knew what to expect. He knew they were going to try and limit explosive plays, play very disciplined, kind of capitalize on any mistakes Penn State makes and kind of just drag them down into the mud. And that's kind of exactly what happened, which I think makes the win all that much more impressive for Penn State, that you were able to play Illinois' game. You were able to play their style. And, that was kind of Illinois' game plan going in. It felt pretty obvious that was what they wanted to do. And Penn State kind of beat them at their own game. Illinois' best chance of winning was kind of, what they did on Saturday with the limited possessions and just playing tight defense, not allowing many explosive plays and things like that. And Penn State was still able to find a way to win that game, playing the style play that Illinois wanted. But I think what it does is it tells you that Penn State can win that way. I don't know if I would say that they, necessarily want to win that way. I think they would prefer to have maybe some more explosive plays and maybe a little bit more effectiveness in the passing game, but it also tells you that they can win that way if they have to. And if that's how, teams want to play them, they've kind of proven that they can still be a threat in the run game, which I think just gives opposing defenses, a little bit more to worry about.
Joel, it was also a huge night for Abdul Carter. He gets 2 sacks. He's up to 3 in 4 games. Obviously, he gets compared to Micah Parsons because he wears the same number. But they play different positions. And at this point, I think we're 2 defensive coordinators ago for where Micah Parsons was and where Abdul Carter is. Should we expect kind of Abdul Carter to be looking more like the Micah Parsons of the pros and racking up these sacks? Because I think we also know that, under Manny Diaz, they weren't necessarily that wasn't necessarily the goal of the defensive ends to pile up big stats. You wanted to get a lot of pressures, and Chop Robinson certainly did that. Adisa Isaac was part of that. Those guys are off to the NFL, but they didn't put up massive sack numbers because Manny Diaz liked to bring different personnel in the blitz. He liked to use defensive backs and things of that nature. What does dominance look like from Abdul Carter for these next 8 games? Is it, a ton of sacks, or is it maybe something closer to what Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac were doing last season?
Yeah. Obviously, there's different ways to dominate. You can be held off the stat sheet, but still have a huge impact on the game. especially just, mentally for the opposing quarterback if they always see you kind of in their peripheral vision, kind of rushing passes and things like that. So it is kind of hard statistically to measure, a defensive end on how successful they were able to be. Obviously, everyone points to sacks, but, their, pressures and things like that can also come into play. And so, his impact might not always be recorded in the stat sheet, but I thought, obviously he was able to put up some big stats against Illinois, and I thought it was kind of a breakout game of sorts. Obviously, everyone knows who he is. He was a projected first-round pick heading into the season, everything like that, so he wasn't some unknown guy, but I would call it kind of a breakout for the defensive end position since he made that transition.
Yeah, I would
it was
agree.
the first time it was the first time we've seen him have kind of a major impact from that role. So I think, if you're Penn State, you're hoping to see more of that. And we heard from him, we heard from Franklin that, they were kind of asking him to do more in this game than they had in the past. This was the first time that we saw him kind of moving around the field. He played on both the left and right side. He was kind of back and forth between defensive end and linebacker for this game, which is really the first time they moved him around like that. And they kind of said his comfort level within the defense has increased now, and they feel like they can kind of use him in different ways. And I think that's something that's only going to continue. So, they were kind of saying after the game, like this is the fun part. Like the best part about his performance is it's only going to get better because we're going to continue to kind of add more to his play and use him even more creatively now that he's getting more comfortable. So I think, you're kind of expecting to see more of an impact because I know through the first few games, there was some talk about, maybe he should have stayed at linebacker because he hasn't been, as productive through the first few games. But obviously what we saw against Illinois, if he's able to replicate that against some other Big Ten offenses, that would be really impressive to see, even if it's not necessarily showing up in the stat sheet, just kind of, being in the backfield and putting pressure on the quarterback and rushing throws and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, it's nice if you can get sacks and force fumbles and all that. But again, I think just kind of watching, how he plays, I think this is one of those situations where the eye test will tell you a lot more than the box score. So if you're watching him, you should be able to see his impact. And again, they plan on moving him around into a bunch of different spots moving forward. So I think, his impact should only grow.
Yeah, that's where I think, sites like PFF do a good job of capturing what you said, which was previously, more difficult to measure, which is pressures. They measure hurries, they measure hits. How many times do you get to the quarterback, even if he gets the ball away? Because those things matter over the course of a game. So, I think that's what we learned a lot last season and the last couple of years with Manny Diaz is, how you can look at a full player through the lens of pressures and not just, how often they get home. Anything stand out to you about UCLA, Joel? They're last in the Big Ten, 1-3. They're last in a pretty huge Big Ten. So the line is 28 as of this morning on DraftKings. Kind of getting back to our discussion here at the beginning, how close does Penn State need to get to that number for people to feel confident heading into, what is probably going to be the second biggest game of the season at USC in 2 weeks?
Yeah, I think Penn State should cover that spread. And if they don't, I think something's gone wrong. You mentioned 28. That's obviously a pretty big number for, a game between two power conference opponents. But when you look at, kind of the struggles that UCLA has had this season, they haven't looked great. Their only win was against Hawaii, and it wasn't, dominant by any means. I think they won that by 3 points or something. And then when you dive a little bit deeper into the statistics, you look at UCLA's run game. They're second to last in the country in yards per game. They're one spot below Kent State, and we all know what Penn State was able to do against them. And so you look at that, and then you pair that with Penn State's defensive line. Abdul Carter and Denai Dennison, and all those other guys that Penn State has, and the success that they've been able to have there. I think it's just a huge mismatch. I mean, I think this is one of those games where Penn State just kind of dominates along that front, kind of similar to what we saw against Michigan State last year, where they had negative rushing yards for most of the game. I think it could end up being kind of a similar performance to that, where Penn State's just able to completely eliminate the run game because UCLA has been pretty bad there. And that's, against non-conference opponents. That's not really against, kind of the tougher teams. So, I mean, they've struggled already. I think they have 55 yards, something like that on the ground per game. And now they're facing the best defense that they've played all year. So I think Penn State should have a lot of success there. And I look at that alone, just kind of that huge mismatch that we have there. And I think that kind of will control the game. That'll allow Penn State to really dominate in this one. And then you look at the quarterback situation where Ethan Garbers has been questionable since getting banged up in their last game, and he hasn't practiced all week, so we're not sure if he'll go out. But you know what? Even if he does go out there, he'll probably still be injured. I don't think he'll be 100% if he does play. And B, it's not like he's been, a great quarterback so far. He's been, a below average quarterback through 4 games. And so even if he does play, he'll probably be injured. And it's not like he's a very good quarterback to begin with, no offense to him personally, but just, the stats aren't there. And so you kind of look, UCLA's in a very tough situation when you consider the run game struggles, plus now there's a question mark at quarterback. So you wonder what they'll be able to do in the passing game. And it's just, I don't know how they're going to score any points against Penn State.
Yeah, it could be a lot like that Kent State game. Maybe not quite as many points and yards for Penn State, but, I think the over-under is something like 46 or something. So even Vegas isn't expecting UCLA to score more than 7 or 10 points. And Penn State should be able to easily clear that to get the win offensively. I think the question is how much further beyond that can you go? Joel, Indiana, and Rutgers are both off to undefeated starts, which I wouldn't necessarily, under normal circumstances in the old Big Ten East, say is a huge deal in the 4-team playoff. But here's the situation. You got a 12-team playoff now, which means more Big Ten teams are hypothetically have playoff spots available to them. And you look at the schedules. Indiana only has Michigan and Ohio State that seem like likely losses for them. But even the way Michigan's played, are you for sure writing Indiana off in that game? I don't know. Then Rutgers has the best teams they have left are USC and Illinois. And I would expect Rutgers to be in both of those games. I don't look at either one of those games as unwinnable for them. Greg Schiano avoids Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan completely. What level of concern do you have that those teams are going to complicate a potential 10-2 path to the playoff for Penn State if they can, win the games that they should be the better team and maybe make some noise in these bigger games?
Yeah, so obviously they're both off to really great starts, and it probably helps that they're not stuck in the Big Ten East anymore. Obviously, the Big Ten overall is getting tougher, but I think they both have, pretty favorable schedules this year, like you mentioned. And I think I've been more impressed with Illinois if I had to pick out of the two. I think they've done a really good job in just the way that they've been winning by, a lot of points, not just winning, but kind of blowing out all of their opponents to this point. And it's not just, cupcakes. They're playing, other Big Ten schools and things like that and finding success. So I think Indiana is pretty legit. And again, if they are able to take care of business against the teams they're favored against, they could be looking at 10-2, maybe even 11-1. And then that would put them in kind of that bid thief situation. But I just don't see the playoff committee choosing them over Penn State. Just kind of given the way that the schedule plays out, I feel like even a 10-2 Penn State would probably get in over an 11-1 Indiana, although it would be tough and you'd probably have to look at kind of common opponents and things like that. There would really be an argument there. But yeah, I think that's definitely in the cards. Rutgers, I know, got a little bit lucky against Washington. I think Washington had like 5 turnovers and outgained Rutgers by like 200 yards or something. So I think they were a little bit lucky to come away with that one. And I think, I don't think Rutgers is a good enough team to kind of, finish in that 10-2, 9-3 range. I think, they'll probably slip up at some point, even if they're favored. I just don't know if the team is at the level to kind of avoid, losing to an underdog or to a team that is supposed to be worse. I think, Rutgers might slip up a couple of times. I don't anticipate them, kind of, reaching that 9-10 win range. Although, not completely out of the cards again, kind of given their schedule and how they've looked. I do think they're a decent team with some decent wins so far, Washington, Virginia Tech. But again, I just don't know if they're able to kind of maintain that throughout all of Big Ten play. Again, they probably should have lost to Washington, you could argue. And so I think, they'll have probably some more games like that down the road where against those kind of middle tier Big Ten teams where a couple of them will be able to jump up and beat Rutgers.
We always talk about the downsides of the old divisional format in the Big Ten with Penn State having to play Ohio State and Michigan every year. But I think this is part of the downside of the new format for Penn State is you don't get to beat these teams that have been buried in the Big Ten East, and they can possibly go out and pull an end around on you. I tend to agree with your analysis there. I just look at that Rutgers schedule and saying, which game are you picking them to lose specifically? For sure. I don't know. And so that'll be interesting to see how things play out. And then you wonder too, what the impact of them having a little magic in Piscataway could be. I think back to, I don't know if you remember, Joel, You might have been too young, making me feel dated, but that 2007 season when they had all those big games in Piscataway and they were 1-2 in the country. And I think we all knew that was somewhat propped up by the lower quality of the Big East that maybe people hadn't adjusted for in the polls. But regardless, Rutgers was in that conversation with Greg Schiano, the same guy who's the coach now, and they were able to have a really special season. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to watch that play out. I'll wrap up on this, Joel. Similar, in this playoff discussion, and it's at the periphery of the season. I think we have to bring it up on most of these podcasts. There's been a lot of discourse this week about how the Alabama-Georgia game, it doesn't matter because they're both going to be in the playoff, blah, blah, blah. I think it's going to matter a lot because I think Georgia's road just got a lot harder. They have a difficult schedule. They have Tennessee. Who else left? They got three other Texas. They got Texas on there. So you've already got one loss, and you still got to go and face those teams. That's number one. And let's just say hypothetically, you win those games and somehow get to the SEC championship. Now you got to beat Bama again for sure. You don't have the luxury of maybe Bama taking an extra loss and not being in the SEC championship game. And so you got to beat Bama once, and then you might have to beat them in a third game in the playoff. I think it's a big disadvantage, especially if you don't win the SEC. You got to go, play an extra game, which is difficult. It just seems to me, Joel, like a lot of people are writing off the advantage that is baked into this playoff of winning your conference, and the easier road you have to winning your conference is the easier road you have to winning a national championship. And that's why these games do still matter a lot, because I still kind of look at it as it's a 4-team playoff that other teams are trying to get into and play their way into, as opposed to just the playoffs that we think about them in the NFL, where there's only one team that gets a 1 week bye. I think that game mattered, Joel. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. I can see both sides of the argument. I can kind of understand where you're coming from because, I would say, if you look at last year between Alabama and Georgia when they play in the SEC championship game, Alabama beats Georgia and knocks them out of the playoff race despite them, going undefeated through the regular season. And so, maybe in past years, this is the type of game that might eliminate Georgia from the playoffs potentially, depending on how other teams around the country perform. But at the same time, it still felt like it was a big game, just, again, like you mentioned, with the seeding for the playoffs and everything like that, with the first 4 conference championships, which I think looks a lot more interesting at this point because obviously you're going to have, the Big Ten and SEC championships at the top. But then, the ACC champion or the Big 12 champion are going to get those 3 and 4 seeds in the playoffs. And I don't know if there's any team in either conference that is deserving of those spots. So I think maybe we need to kind of rework the way it's structured because, again, a team like Georgia, if they miss out on, if they don't end up winning the SEC, they're going to be stuck, at best 5th, potentially lower.
I think that's good, Joel. I think that's the way it should. If you don't win your conference, it should be harder. And even if you're better than another Power 4 conference champion, your road should be harder, in my opinion. If you don't win your conference, tough crap. And I want to mention this too, Joel. It's not even just does this game matter to Bama and Georgia. I think you can make a coherent argument that they're both going to be there and playing significant games and all that. But I did our Penn State Bowl projections this week for Post-Gazette.com. And I think, early in that game, Joel, when Penn State when Georgia was up, or Alabama was up 28-0 on Georgia, I think you were looking at it as a Penn State fan. Can we climb past Georgia in the rankings? Can we be in that range of teams that would host a home playoff game? And now Georgia's still in front of them because they make that big comeback. The results still mattered a lot for Penn State because certainly there is still a long way to go. But just in terms of the way things shook out this week, for Penn State, that was the difference between hosting a playoff game and having to go on the road. So I think that these games, as we get late in the season, are going to be, intriguing, not necessarily just for the teams involved, but if you're a team on the fringe of the playoff, the fringe of hosting a playoff game, the fringe of being able to be the second team in a conference championship, these outcomes are going to matter and I think maintain a lot of the excitement.
Yeah, well, actually, I think Penn State is kind of one of the teams that's going to be a little bit annoyed by this format, just because, like you mentioned, they're currently number 7. So if we were going to kind of project out the playoffs now, they would actually get bumped down just because there's no ACC or Big 12 teams ranked above them, and so they would fall to number 9 just because of those auto bids. So I think if you're a Penn State fan, the difference between hosting a playoff game at Beaver Stadium and having to go on the road to, wherever it may be across the country is pretty big. Obviously Penn State has one of the best home field advantages in the sport, and any of those other teams that are in the playoff race probably have a really good home field advantage as well. And so that's a huge swing there. And that could, and Penn State probably will finish around that 7, 8, 9 range. Obviously a little bit too early to tell, but based on kind of previous years and how they're projected this year, they'll probably be, one of those teams that's impacted by conference champions. I mean, one way to avoid that would be winning the conference, but I don't know if they'll be able to do that. We'll have to see what happens, against Ohio State and those other teams down the line. But it does impact Penn State a little bit and could make a difference. So a game like that, even though it's an SEC game, if you're a Penn State fan, that's one that you should kind of take interest in, and other games like that. Just for that reason, because you're kind of looking at the playoff race now, and it's not just about being in the top 12 and getting in, but it's where are you seated? Can you win the conference, get a top 4, or can you, play good enough to get top 8 and get that home field advantage? So I think, those types of games Penn State fans should be highly invested in.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are just still in the mode of, are you doing good enough to get into the 12-team field? And I just think we're quickly going to get to a place where people realize, oh, there's a lot of differences within this playoff and tiers and how it affects your ability to win a national championship. I'm just going to say it. I think if you're, a team that has to start on the road in the college football playoff, there's a 90% chance you're not going to win the national championship. Even if you're a really good team, you have to beat 4 really good teams to win the championship. So I think you want to host the game. You want to avoid it entirely if you can. So that's something I think people need to pay attention to and not diminish the value of the regular season. In some ways, I think it has elevated the value in a lot of different ways. So we'll look forward to seeing how that all plays out. We will be back next week, Joel and I, previewing the Penn State USC game. I'll be going to that game in LA. Looking forward to catching it underneath some palm trees in a Big Ten destination, Joel. Should be a lot of fun. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Like we said, we always appreciate any support we can get because we are mostly a Steelers channel here. So it's always nice to have as many people on board on Penn State as we can. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you enjoyed this. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. I will be back Thursday with Paul Zeiss on the Paul Zeiss Show. I'll also be back Sunday breaking down the Steelers-Cowboys games. So stay up late with us for that. Christopher Carter on the North Shore Drive has a lot more Steelers preview content as well. So look forward to another fun week of football. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.